Hey, AP Psych, G Block. Sorry I can't be with you today, especially because this is some really interesting stuff in social psych, but hopefully this will um, still be uh, a good enough facsimile of an actual in-class presence. All right, so last time we met, we read the horrible story and we talked about it and debated it. And fundamentally, what we were trying to think about is how do we attribute um, uh, to what do we attribute people's behavior? Um, do we say that it's because of their personality, or do we say that it's because of their situation? And in the two stories that you had a woman fundamentally on a certain level um, in a very similar situation, right? Forgetting their money and needing to go get back home. And the question then became, we had very different opinions of her actions based on her perceived personality. So what this comes down to is what, as I said before, the fundamental attribution error, which is that we tend to underestimate the impact of the situation and overestimate the impact of personality when we look at why people do what they do. So, this doesn't just this is something that we do to other people, but the funny thing is for ourselves. So, say if we're sort of rude to somebody at the store, we will be the first ones to say, well, for me, it was because I didn't sleep well last night, or I got into a fight with my sister, and that's why I did this. So we'll take the situation to account for ourselves, but we won't do the same for others. All right, so this brings us to this question of, or not question, but the idea of what an attitude is. So an attitude is a feeling that predisposes us to respond in a particular way. That's really the key thing about attitude. This is not just a feeling, but it's a feeling that then brings about a predisposition towards an action, a belief, or something like that. So the image you see here of this young man, his name is Jonathan Farrell, and Jonathan Farrell, it was in September of 2013. He gets into a car accident in Charlotte. It's late at night slash early morning. So he gets into a bad car accident and gets out of his car. He goes and knocks on the door of a house looking for help. And the woman in the house uh, calls the police. She doesn't open the door, just calls the police, says, there's a black man at my door and he's an intruder, right? And please come and please help. Um, and the police arrive, and Farrell, now we don't know for certain what Farrell thought in the moment, because then you'll find out why in a moment. But Farrell runs towards the police when they come, presumably because he's looking for help. He's been in this car accident, and the police shoot him 12 times. They hit him 10 times, and he dies. Um, in this case, the officer was not, uh, he was indicted, but then there was a mistrial, and the judge refused to hear the case again. And so you have this idea of like what's going on here is like, well, somebody knocks on your door asking for help because it's the time of night, because it's a young black man, these predispositions, right, these attitudes, then very much change the outcome of what happens in the situation. Something also very similar happened just 2 months later in November of 2013 with a young woman named Renisha McBride in Dearborn, Michigan. She also gets into a car accident, sort of early morning, late night, and knocks on a door to get help. And the man who answers the door um, immediately opens the door and immediately fires a 12 gauge shotgun at her head, and she is killed. So we see this kind of how attitudes, particularly um, racist attitudes, can play into very dire consequences. So it's not just attitudes that will predispose you to picking a certain major when you go to college, or choosing something for dessert, but it can have very, very real dire consequences. All right. So now we look at how we can possibly change this is a little lighter, how we could change your attitudes. So there's two ways we could change your attitude: central route persuasion or peripheral route persuasion, or two ways we can that we're going to look at here. Advertisements are great for thinking about changing your attitudes, because advertisements, if you think about it, the whole point of an ad is to try to change your attitude towards a product. So here on your left, you see an old cigarette ad from the 50s. And these kinds of ads are really interesting because you look at them and it's making an argument, right? It's got a lot of text. It's telling you, it's giving you a reason for why you should smoke these cigarettes. It's a preposterous, I mean, just imagine the idea of doctors telling you to smoke cigarettes, right? But nevertheless, right? So that's what's happening here. Now in this ad, ooh, we've got we've got, of course, David Beckham, and this is using peripheral route persuasion, right? Where it's trying to uh, convince you to buy these Emporio Armani underpants, not necessarily even because you'll look like David Beckham, but really like, isn't David Beckham incredibly attractive? Don't you want to buy these underpants, right? So I encourage you at this moment just to pause this video for a moment and maybe amongst yourselves think about some advertisements that use central route persuasion and some advertisements that use peripheral route persuasion. Just do this for like 2 minutes or so and see if you can come up with any and then check back in. All right, so I wonder which ones you may have thought of. Some things that we talked about in other classes included that central route persuasion, like somebody pointed out that paper towel ads always use central route persuasion. They're always trying to make an argument about absorbency and have demonstrations. Makeup ads often are, telling you that this mascara will make your lashes 3 times longer. It's very, very scientific, right? And then for peripheral route persuasion, we had talked about how perfume ads often have celebrities or good-looking people in them. They're sort of more about stories or advertisements for Apple products will have kind of fun music and people dancing around, but they don't really tell you anything about the product. It's really just about kind of making you have this nice feeling. Kylie Jenner's Pepsi ad came up as well. I'm trying to think of any others, but hopefully you guys came up with some others. All right, so let's move forward. Now we're going to think about how if we change our actions, if we change our behaviors, we can change our attitudes. So this phenomenon that when you guys got it as a multiple choice question, you didn't believe it was real, the foot in the door phenomenon, which is when you are going to begin it by asking for something small, and then hopefully in the future you'll be able to make good on a bigger request. So here are some examples. The classic experiment for foot in the door was the researchers went around and asked people if they would put a small sticker in their window supporting a political cause. And for the people who said yes, they went back a week later and asked if they could put a big sign in their yard. Now, the people who said yes, we'll put a little sticker in the window, were far more likely to acquiesce to the much larger request of the big sign in the yard. Now, if that's foot in the door, door in the face is going to be what you see in this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon here. This is when you ask for a big thing with the hopes that when you bring it down to a little thing, they'll say yes. So would you be willing to donate $100 to my Save the Kittens and Puppies organization? No. Well, how about just $10? And then the person says yes. All right. So you could probably think of other examples of foot in the door and door in the face. Another way that we can think about actions and attitudes is the way that we act in roles. Like think about the Stanford prison experiment, right? That was all about roles that we take by the flip of a coin. You're either a guard or you're a prisoner, and you take on the role of the guard and you engage in the actions of the guard, and it changes your attitude towards the prisoners. So again, I'm just going to ask you to pause this video, and I want you guys to think about what are some of the defining characteristics and expectations that you have as SAGE students. So what is the role of the SAGE student? All right, so just pause, maybe take about 5 minutes and consider some things, okay? And then come back to this video. All right. So I will just tell you, hopefully you had an interesting discussion. I will just tell you some things that came up in other classes. The one thing that people said, oh, well, it's Sage. You're supposed to work really hard, but you're supposed to act like you didn't work that hard. So pretend before a test you say like, oh, I didn't study at all, when in actuality you did. The other thing that was said was that everybody likes to brag about how much stress they're under or sort of compete. We call it the stress Olympics. Like when one person says, "Oh, I have this much work to do. I've stayed up all night," and somebody says, "Well, no, I stayed up till 5 in the morning, and I have 3 tests next week," and right, and it goes on. So I'd be interested. Maybe next week you guys can tell me what else you talked about. All right, moving forward. Cognitive dissonance theory. So cognitive dissonance theory is when our attitudes and our actions clash, we reduce dissonance by changing our attitudes. We'd all love to believe that maybe we would change our actions, but we don't. We change our attitudes. So I'm going to ask you to go to the video, the cognitive dissonance video. All right. Go ahead and watch that video and then come back to this. All right. Okay, so I'm assuming you're back. You watched the cognitive dissonance video. And yeah, so that kind of gives you a sense. It really runs counter to what you would think, right? You'd think the person who was paid $20 would actually believe that the experiment was fun. That's not the case. Actually, we find that it's the person that is paid $1 that changes their mind because they need their actions and their attitudes to match. Okay, let's move forward. Um, the chameleon effect. So the chameleon effect is when I think even somebody in one group in this class maybe did their first research project for this class on the chameleon effect, where you measured yawning, like how contagious yawning was. Maybe it wasn't this class, maybe it was another, maybe it was a different class. But in any case, um, so the chameleon effect is the way that this was researched was that researchers would have a confederate. A confederate means that's somebody who's working with the researchers. So they'd have a room full of students, and they'd have a confederate, which means somebody who's in on the experiment, sit in the room, and then they'd start kind of tapping their pen, or maybe they'd yawn or jiggle their leg, and then they would see how many people sort of unintentionally start mimicking that behavior. And that's the chameleon effect. Makes sense. It's named after a chameleon. So the next thing that I want you to watch is to go ahead and click on the video that's titled The Ash Experiment, one of the very famous conformity experiments that we see in psychology, and it's also a pretty funny video. So go ahead and take a look at that, and then when you're done, why don't we go on to the next, watch the social psych lecture part 2. All right. So I'll see you on the flip side.